Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In this special six-part summer series, you will hear recordings of papers delivered at the Robert Menzies Institute's conference on the Menzies Ascendency, Implementing a Liberal Agenda and Consolidating Gains 1954 to 1961. The conference was held over 2 days from the 23rd to the 24th of November 2023. In today's episode of the summer series, you will hear from Dr. David Furse-Roberts on standing for the most ample provision in respect of old age and sickness, the Menzies Government and health reform, followed by Dr. Damien Freeman and Senator Andrew Bragg on Menzies, Hasluck, Wentworth and Indigenous Peoples, and finally Julian Leeser MP on Menzies, Presbyterians, Catholics and Jews, lessons on religious freedom for today.
Well, it's a great honour to be back here at the Robert Menzies Institute for the 2023 annual conference, and I'd like to thank Zach very much and everyone involved for today. Well, campaigning in Fremantle for the by-election of 1945 for the seat vacated by the recently deceased Prime Minister John Curtin, Menzies declared his new party as standing unhesitatingly for the most ample provision in respect of old age and sickness. This paper will discuss the seminal health and aged care reforms of Menzies' second term as Prime Minister in the period from 1953 to 60. It will cover his government's main legislative achievements on public health, including the National Health Act of 1953, the Aged Persons Homes Act of 1954 and the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme implemented in 1960. When Menzies returned to power in 1949, he desired to chart a new direction in health policy from the preceding Chifley Labor government. Reflecting Liberal principles, such an approach would seek more of a private enterprise answer to the treatment and care of the sick. And private enterprise here meant not only commercial businesses, but also churches, charities, and other voluntary associations. To better appreciate the landmark health reforms of Menzies and his government, it is valuable to just explore the liberal philosophy from which they sprung. With popular thinking tending to see health policy initiatives as more typical of Labor governments, it would be easy to assume that health policy had a social democratic or democratic socialist impulse. Yet the inspiration behind Menzies' initiatives in healthcare were profoundly liberal. The 20th century liberalism of Menzies stressed not only individual self-reliance, but also the care of the poor and the sick. In his William Quayle lecture of 1954, Menzies affirmed that the protection of the poor and the weak and the elimination of the causes of poverty and weakness are undoubtedly the supreme business of politics. One can recognise that without in any way ceasing to insist that the first duty of every man is to stand on his own feet, to form his own judgments and to accept his own responsibilities. Menzies' approach to healthcare of maximising individual initiative and free enterprise, on the one hand, with the provision of ameliorative social welfare measures on the other, accorded with the thinking of key 20th century liberal theorists such as Friedrich Hayek. In his Road to Serfdom of 1944, Hayek maintained that there is no incompatibility in principle between the state providing greater social security in this way and the preservation of individual freedom. Balancing these two principles, the Menzies government delivered healthcare policies calculated to ameliorate the suffering of the sick and frail aged without compromising the interests of private enterprise and individual initiative. In the delivery of his health policy from 1953 to 1960, Menzies was assisted by two ministers for health, Dr. Earl Page, followed by Dr. Donald Cameron. Born in Grafton in 1880, Earl Page had trained as a doctor at the University of Sydney, opened a private hospital and worked briefly as a medical surgeon during the First World War. Elected to federal parliament as a member for Cowper in 1919, Page was one of the leading lights of the early Country Party, leading it into coalition with the then Nationalist Party from 1923, and then the United Australia Party until 1939. Following the death of Joe Lyons in April 1939, Page served briefly as Australia's 11th Prime Minister until the UAP elected Robert Menzies as its leader and Prime Minister 3 weeks later. As is widely known, the relationship between Menzies and Page was difficult, yet Menzies in 1949 was magnanimous enough to include Page in his cabinet as Health Minister. In his 6 years in the portfolio, Page was responsible primarily for the passage of the 1953 National Health Act. In January 1956, Donald Cameron succeeded Page as Menzies' second Minister for Health, serving until December 1961. Born in Ipswich, Queensland in 1900, Cameron also trained as a doctor in Sydney and served as a medical officer at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital during the late 1920s and early 30s. With the outbreak of the Second World War, Cameron served in the Medical Corps of the Australian Army and was awarded an OBE in 1946. Joining Menzies' new Liberal Party, Cameron was elected to the new Queensland seat of Oxley in what was known as the class of 1949. Appointed as Minister for Health by Menzies in 1956, he was responsible for introducing the 1959 National Health Act that finally brought the PBS into being in 1960. So starting with Earl Page as Minister, the first major health reform of the Menzies Government was the introduction of the National Health Act in 1953. Just prior to his election in 1949 as Prime Minister, Menzies had expressed his opposition to a nationalised system of healthcare, favoured by the incumbent Labor government and also followed by their Labor counterparts in the United Kingdom under the Prime Ministership of Clement Attlee. Seeking to avoid government monopoly in the provision of healthcare, Menzies called for a common-sense approach entailing the cooperation of the states, of the municipalities, of hospital managements, of friendly societies, and of the medical, dental, pharmaceutical and allied professions. Such an approach would not only seek more of a private enterprise answer to the treatment and care of the sick, but would serve to protect the sanctity of a voluntary doctor-patient relationship. Menzies declared that his government would stand utterly opposed to the socialist idea that medical service should become a salaried government service. Differentiating his government's new approach to healthcare from that of a preceding Chifley government, the Menzies introduced his new legislation to deal with comprehensively certain medical services and medical benefits. Under the National Health Act, these would be based upon contributions made by individuals to a medical benefits fund, conducted by registered medical benefits organisations, supplemented by a Commonwealth benefit, being a benefit payable by the Commonwealth in respect of a professional service rendered to a contributor. According to Menzies, the underlying principle of these provisions was that the individual doctor-patient relationship would be preserved and the disadvantages of a fully nationalised and government-conducted scheme averted. Speaking in support of the legislation, Menzies' parliamentary colleague, Percy Josk, told the House of Representatives that under the medical benefits scheme of this government, medicine is not socialised. The patient is entitled to choose his or her own doctor, and the doctor is neither a servant of the state nor bound to prescribe in accordance with a formula. Both Menzies and his Minister for Health, Dr. Earl Page, were studious to prevent Australia from going down the post-war British path of a nationalised health service, such as the NHS, that had witnessed a palpable deterioration in the doctor-patient relationship and the general diminution of private medical practice. Thus, Menzies' National Health Act would seek to restore the proper involvement of private enterprise in the ministering of health care and treatment. Now, this reform to general health care was followed by substantial reforms to Australian aged care under the Aged Persons Homes Act of 1954, which gave churches and charities a greater hand in the provision of aged care facilities and services. In this vein, the Act was wholly consistent with Menzies' approach of engaging private enterprise in the delivery of health and aged care. Under the Aged Persons Homes Act, the Commonwealth paid subsidies for the building of aged persons' homes on a pound-for-pound basis to non-profit organisations, particularly religious organisations, or those of which the principal objects or purpose was charitable or benevolent. At one level, the policy was adopted because it was the most effective way of rapidly expanding the provision of aged care accommodation. Most significantly, however, the initiative was deeply rooted in the concept of community philanthropy that Menzies regarded as so integral to social welfare. With churches and private organisations receiving government grants under the legislation, they were able to provide personalised accommodation and services according to the needs of the individual. Introducing the legislation to Parliament, Menzies' Minister for Social Services, William McMahon, who later became Prime Minister, of course, told the House of Representatives that the Commonwealth was anxious to provide leadership, to provide a solution to what is a delicate human problem, the care and companionship of aged people. On the economic side, the legislation would contribute to the capital cost of approved homes for aged people, whilst on the social side, it would enable older persons to live in their surroundings as close as possible to those of normal domestic life. With all the associations we think of when we think of our home, in particular, the companionship of husband and wife would be preserved. A few years after the passage of the Aged Persons Homes Act in 1954, Menzies spoke with great pride of its legacy when he addressed an audience of Wesley Mission in Sydney. And he said, "Why is it that I am so proud of this great matter of homes for aged people? It isn't because they're institutions, it's because they are homes. It's because they set out to reproduce for the individual, not the sense of the institution like the old asylums that one used to walk by as a boy, but a home with friendliness in it, administered with loving kindness, the maintenance of friendships, the sense of personal identity and of individual dignity." For Menzies, it was this characteristic that gave them an individuality and quality which really preserve the human dignity of the people who go into them. Recalling his boyhood years in Ballarat from the early 1900s, Menzies had found himself depressed by the pitiable plight of elderly people that dwelt in institutions with this cold, impersonal and clinical feel to them. With this early experience etched in his memory, Menzies was resolved to help humanise the living conditions of elderly Australians with the Aged Persons Homes Act, designed to give greater resources for non-profit organisations to run aged care facilities. For Menzies, this was not simply an innovation in aged care policy, but one of the great revolutions of our time, where such palpable improvements to the living conditions and dignity of senior Australians signified the progress of human civilisation. Turning to the provision of affordable medicines for all, the Menzies Government introduced the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme to make life-saving medicines affordable for ordinary Australians. To be sure, this idea of a pharmaceutical benefits scheme was first proposed by the wartime Curtin Labor government in 1944, which had even introduced legislation to bring the PBS into effect. Vigorous opposition to the scheme from the Australian branch of the British Medical Association and other medical stakeholders, however, resulted in a successful High Court challenge to the PBS, which rendered it unconstitutional. The succeeding Chifley Labor government reintroduced the PBS with a successful carriage of a 1946 referendum, giving it new powers to legislate it without constitutional challenge. The success of this 1946 referendum was made possible by a qualifying clause the government had negotiated with Menzies, then in opposition. With the constitutional obstacle to the PBS removed, the Chifley government's execution of the scheme, however, floundered, as it encountered stiff resistance from the Australian BMA and many doctors. This opposition to the scheme stemmed from a fear that it was seen to be the first stepping stone in the Labor government's objective to socialise medicine and health care. After Labor's defeat in 1949, the suspicions of the medical profession abated, and this created a more congenial climate for Menzies and his government to revive the PBS. The other factor in Menzies' favour was medical and scientific advances in medicine, increasing a popular demand in the 1950s for pharmaceuticals and life-altering medications. With this trend making the case for a national PBS all the more compelling, the Menzies government revisited the scheme and passed the National Health Act of 1959 to resurrect the PBS, which came into effect from 1st of March 1960. Speaking of the rationale behind the new PBS, Menzies Minister for Health, Donald Cameron, told Parliament in 1959 that such initiatives needed to be capable of modification and improvement from time to time as circumstances permit, yet done in a way that is financially responsible and not unduly burdensome to taxpayers. Accordingly, the new PBS included a patient contribution or co-payment of 5 shillings, which would be 50 cents in the new decimal currency back then, for each medicine to ensure that the scheme would be financially sustainable over the longer term. Reflecting the growth of the pharmaceutical industry, the rebirthed PBS included a much more expansive list of medicines than that proposed by Earl Page as Health Minister. In addition to the small number of expensive and life-saving drugs, such as penicillin, the sulphur drugs, vaccines, serums, diphtheria, antitoxin and insulin, the PBS covered a broad range of medications available to the general public at the subsidised rate. By capping all medicines at 5 shillings, it gave assurances to all patients of the cost they would incur for their prescriptions. If a medicine was worth less than 5 shillings, it would be charged at a rate to be determined by the individual chemist or pharmacy. To conclude, the health and aged care reforms of the Menzies government balanced social welfare with personal initiative and responsibility. In so doing, they acknowledged a strategic role for government, yet also a critical part to be played by private enterprise in the provision of health and aged care. Vesting individuals with a greater sense of responsibility was the thinking behind the contributory principle, integral to both the National Health Act of 1953 and the relaunched PBS in 1960. As the practical outworking of Menzies' liberal philosophy, Australian health and aged care would make ample provision for the sick and the aged, but with policy mechanisms in place to ensure that such obligations did not fall to the shoulders of government alone, but to the goodwill, initiative and resource of personal individuals and private enterprises. Thank you very much.
Senator Bragg is on his way and should be here in a few minutes, and we're doing this paper together, so I'm going to start and he'll take over when he gets here shortly. The idea for this paper came from the fact that I, as the general editor of the Kapunda Press, commissioned Andrew Bragg to write a book a couple of years ago, which was called Burudja, subtitled The Liberal Case for National Reconciliation. And his book consisted of 3 essays, the first of which was a sort of long historical essay about the Liberal Party and its approach to Indigenous affairs. And so I thought it would be fitting to adapt that and reflect on some of the themes in that looked at this period of the Menzies ascent. So I'm going to offer some introductory remarks and then he'll take over when he gets here. I have to express my thanks again to Zach for being generous in allowing us for a sort of broad understanding of the Menzies ascent period in this essay, because we're really looking at things that happened the year before from 1953 and things that get underway at the end of this period but don't actually fall into legislation until just after the period. But let me say something about a few of the developments in Aboriginal affairs during this time, the attitudes of Menzies to Aboriginal people and Aboriginal affairs, and something about the historiography of Menzies and his attitude to Aboriginal people, and then I'll hand over to Senator Bragg after that. So we've heard already mention of a few things that have happened in Aboriginal affairs during this period, and also we've heard about the significance of incremental change and the idea that gradually you have change. So you start by allowing Aboriginal men who served in the Defence Forces to be allowed to vote, then you extend that to all people. So the reform in 1962 to the Electoral Act that said all Aboriginal people could be put on the roll. And it is a feature that this happens incrementally. The most significant thing, I think, is the Welfare Ordinance of 1953, which is introduced by Hasluck and which is developed on the basis of the principles of assimilation and social advancement, which will be one of the 2 main things that Senator Bragg will talk about after I finish. The other thing that he'll talk about is William Wentworth, and his work to establish IATSIS, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs. And Wentworth writes a paper in 1959, and he's advocating for this, and gradually it gets enough support that an interim council is set up, and then finally an Act of Parliament to give it a statutory basis. And those would be the 2 things that Senator Bragg will talk about. The other major achievement of this period, another example of incremental change, is the Social Services Act of 1959, which enabled increased numbers of Aboriginal people to receive social service benefits from the Commonwealth. And it enabled all Aborigines who were not designated as nomadic or primitive to receive maternity allowances, widows' pensions, old age and invalid pensions, unemployment benefits and sickness benefits. Prior to 1959, access to benefits was dependent on Aboriginal people being exempted from the state and territory protection laws. So you see, this is another example of how gradually change allows the people to come into the general approach to social security rather than a special treatment. As I say, the Electoral Act is reformed in 1962, and then just after the period we're interested in 1965, Menzies introduces his bill for a referendum that would have allowed Aboriginal people to be counted in the census, but would not have changed the race's power. And of course, in 1967, Holt does introduce a bill for a referendum that changes both of those things, and there's something to be said about why it is that Menzies is more cautious there, but I think if Senator Bragg has time, he'll say something about that. What I'd like to say something about now is what we know about Menzies' attitude to Aboriginal people. If you look at the history books, I think I think there's a tendency for historians to make a bit too much of these things. They pick out these very small anecdotes and really, what it seems to say to me, well, let me say a few of the things. So one of the things he's asked what his early recollection of Aboriginal people is, and he speaks of his admiration for their aptitude for football. So he seems to remember them in a positive way. Then he changes his tone, apparently, and becomes more dismissive and talks about them as an idle community lacking ambition. And you see these sort of scraps that historians draw on trying to create a narrative that I think is maybe a bit unfair. It is clear that he, towards the end of his life, he spoke about the Aboriginal problem in a way that suggests to Troy Bramston that he was a neo-Darwinist. I think Bramston actually means a social Darwinist. But anyhow, it's clear that he still has an idea that there's a hierarchy of races and that some races are superior to other races, and that Menzies says that he regards the Aboriginal race as the lowest form of human life. He, on official visits, again, it's pointed out, well, sometimes he didn't seem to be very interested in engaging with Aboriginal culture. On one occasion, he declined an invitation to view Aboriginal paintings at a gallery set up by Albert Namatjira. On the other hand, it's also recalled that on at least one occasion, on one of these official visits, he showed great tenderness when he was taken to see some Aboriginal children on a Presbyterian mission, and he was nursing them on his knee, and he was singing softly to them, and people were moved by how strongly he felt, the affection that he clearly demonstrated towards them. So, my sense is you can't really read too much into any of this, because I think, he showed a range of different attitudes, and I don't think we should be trying to make more of it than that. One thing that does tell us something about his personal attitude is his relationship with his driver, Alf Stafford. And there's a long essay being written about this. Stafford was a Gamilaroi and Darug man. He was in the service of the Commonwealth Transport Department for quite a long time. He drove Menzies, and he bonded with Menzies over a love of cricket, and Menzies clearly became quite close to him. He intervened on a number of occasions to help him out and to create opportunities for him, and they had a long and close relationship. When Heather Henderson was interviewed about him later, she was reunited with Stafford's children, who she'd known as a child, and then she was asked about this, and Paul Daly, who wrote an essay about this relationship, asked her if she or her father realised that Stafford was Aboriginal, and she said to him, when we look back at photos of my father, of course he was, but back then you didn't even give it a thought. And Daly adds a gloss to this, saying, Menzies was no fool, he could probably work it out for himself, but Heather just said it never occurred to her. And I think there's something to her recollection and to the gloss here, because you see Menzies as someone who is comfortable engaging with Aboriginal people as individuals, but someone who didn't seem to take any particular interest in them as Aboriginal people. He was concerned to address the needs of Aboriginal people as people, but didn't see any particular significance in them or in their needs as Aboriginals. And the last thing I want to say before I hand over to Senator Bragg is to say something about the historiography, the attempts by three historians to make sense of Menzies and his attitude to Aboriginal people. So first, Judith Brett presents Menzies as someone who's dismissive of Aboriginal people collectively, although she admits that that he acknowledged that there were Aboriginal people of talent and achievement, and that he expected to see more of these people in future. A.W. Martin seems to have the strongest expression against Menzies. He claims that Menzies showed no curiosity about Aboriginal populations, and he suggests that Menzies' personal lack of interest in meeting Aboriginal people and observing Aboriginal culture symbolised what in many quarters was a prevailing attitude of his time. Troy Bramston rejects Martin's analysis. He points out that there were important initiatives in Aboriginal affairs, some of which I've mentioned, and he rejects the claim that Aboriginal affairs were not on the political agenda at this time. Bramston says that it's clear that Menzies' attitude to race was outdated by the 1960s, and he points out that the fact that when we have the referendum in 1967, there's already a change from what had been proposed in 1965, and he says that reflects the sense in which Menzies was out of date in his thinking about attitudes to do with race in relation to immigration and Indigenous affairs. Bramston says that his final conclusion is, he says that Menzies lacked empathy and understanding of these matters. And it's this conclusion about Menzies lacking empathy and understanding that I'd like to end on, because Bramston may be correct that notwithstanding the developments that happened, there was a lack of empathy and understanding on Menzies' part, but it's significant that Menzies didn't frustrate people in his own government and his party room who did demonstrate empathy and understanding. And really, I think that's the example of Hasluck and Wentworth. Hasluck clearly does demonstrate understanding of Aboriginal people, and this informs his policy making, and Wentworth demonstrates a genuine empathy towards Indigenous people, and that influences his activities in this area. And both of these things happen under Menzies, and I think it's important at least to see his legacy as having enabled these two things. So I'm going to hand over to Senator Bragg to talk a bit about what we see as the significance of Hasluck, Wentworth and Menzies.
Well, thanks very much, Damien. And thank you to Georgina and to Zachary for putting together this program. I was very pleased that the Commonwealth was able to support the creation of this institute some years ago. And as a reader of Menzies' books, I always use him as a reference for whenever I'm asked to give advice to younger people, because he writes in such a simple way, and I like that he was a great advocate of using a simple word rather than a more complicated word, and I think that's an enduring part of his legacy as well. Before I talk about the issues in relation to Hasluck and in relation to Wentworth, I also wanted to recognise Damien's great work. I think he has done a lot of very important work in documenting and chronicling the contribution of liberalism and Indigenous affairs. And as we know from this year's debate, these are important issues. They always will be important issues. And we do have an important legacy here that we ought to remember and reflect upon. In relation to the principal issue that people have written about extensively, which does link to the events of this year, I mean, Menzies was very hesitant to proceed with the changes to Section 51. In fact, the constitutional alteration bill that he passed only dealt with the issues in relation to the census and the counting matter, because I think he was concerned about what it would mean if the Commonwealth did have this power. And while I might not agree with that, with all the benefit of hindsight, you'd have to say that it hasn't been a particularly successful venture, that the granting of that power to the Commonwealth has not been a success in terms of how we would measure the potential and the capacity of the laws to improve the position of Indigenous people in our country over these last 50 years. And so maybe it was his natural hesitation to grant governments more and more powers. Maybe that was a sound position, and one that I think I've changed my mind on it a few times. But right now, I probably wouldn't have changed what Holt had done. But I think it is a good lesson that just because you grant a power to a government doesn't mean it's going to do a good job with it. So in relation to Hasluck, I mean, as Damien has said, he did take a great interest in these matters going back to his youth, and it was the Welfare Ordinance of 53 where the Commonwealth started to move away from race-based policy into a social approach. And I think Hasluck, if you look at his contributions over his lifetime, he showed a real and genuine interest in these matters. And of course he was part of the Menzies Government, which ended up passing the voting rights reforms of 62, which many people have conflated with the 67 referendum, which people in this room will know only too well. But Hasluck, I think, did show a great deal of compassion, as Damien has set out. Wentworth is one of the more interesting characters in the history of the Liberal Party. I'd have to say I think he's been too easily forgotten. When I interviewed Philip Ruddock, who'd served with Wentworth for the project that Damien and I worked on together a couple of years ago, I mean, Ruddock described Wentworth as someone that would, on a parliamentary recess, go into his four-wheel drive and disappear into the bush for weeks and weeks because he wanted to better engross himself in the culture and the matters which were important to Indigenous people. So he was an interesting character for his day, and I think even today he's an interesting figure. So the question of the role of the Liberal Party in playing a role in conserving Indigenous culture I've always thought was an interesting one. I would say the biggest step taken to conserve Indigenous language, culture and so on was taken with the establishment of AATSIS, which is the Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. Now, this was put onto the agenda, as we wrote in our paper, by Wentworth in a speech in 1959. Now, the Menzies Government then passes the AATSIS legislation in 64, and then Wentworth is the first Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, of course, in the Holt Government. So he becomes the person in charge of the agency that he has sought to establish. And he sought to do that with people like Stanner and some of the other anthropologists of the day. But I mean, effectively, the idea was that these things were only going to be around for a particular timetable, time frame, and they needed to be conserved, and they have been. And for anyone who's been through AATSIS in Canberra, I mean, it is an amazing treasure trove of different bits and pieces of language and culture. And a lot of it is, of course, captured on different materials which are degrading because of age and time, and I think they're spending a lot of money on trying to keep all that together. But effectively, Wentworth was a radical in his day, and he did consistently put in his public advocacy a view that was early in its day on the notion of overturning paternalism. I think he was very much of the view that if we're going to be making policies or doing things in these areas, that we ought to be trying to engage as closely as possible with the people who were the subjects of these laws and these policies. And the quotes appear in the chapter that Damien and I put together. But effectively, he makes these statements in relation to the running of AATSIS, and he makes these statements in relation to the introduction of other bills and legislation. So effectively, in summary, as I said, I mean, I've got an open mind about whether or not the granting of power to the Commonwealth in 67 was I think it was the right thing on balance, but I don't think it's been used effectively. I think the issues we've been discussing this year, I think, is a good justification for that. So in a sense, Menzies was vindicated in that he was hesitant about that. Look, Hasluck and Wentworth were both radical for their day, and I think they both made very strong and enduring contributions. And we have got to do a better job of talking about the good things that we have done along this journey. And Labor is much better at the mythology and much better at talking about what they've been able to do over the long run of history. Whereas if you look at some of the substantive elements, whether it would be the Fraser government and land rights, or whether it be the referendum that halted in '67, or even, as I say, the establishment of a body that was designed to conserve this culture and tradition through AATSIS. I mean, these are all things that have been done, and a lot of them were anchored around that Menzies period. So I think if the historical position has been by the mainstream that Menzies was indolent or not interested, or didn't have ministers that wanted to do things in this space, I mean, that is a false reading of history. And so I wanted to commend to you again the work that Damien in particular has done over the long run. I think it's an important contribution, and irrespective of whatever has happened this year, I think these issues are important issues in our country, and we ought to maintain a level of study on these matters.
Australia's a wonderful country. It's a country with an Indigenous heritage spanning some 65,000 years, and to that extent I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where you're meeting, the Bunurong and Wiradjuri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. We're also a country with a British foundation. We've been deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, providing us with constitutional government, the rule of law, the separation of powers, the separation of church and state, property rights and a system of parliamentary government that celebrates liberty and the equality of all people. And we're a people with a great multicultural character and destiny that draws people from all around the world to our shores. It's wonderful to be here at the Robert Menzies Institute, and I want to acknowledge and congratulate your Executive Director, Georgina Downer, on all the fantastic work that she's been doing, in particular assembling such a magnificent program as there has been for this conference. As a former executive director of your sister organisation, the Menzies Research Centre, I've pondered too the remarkable life of Sir Robert Menzies. I've thought about his enormous intellect, his deep understanding of the Australian people, his ability to face adversity, his capacity to change after setbacks, and of course his political success, which will stand the test of time. I came to the conclusion that whilst times change, and the particularity of Menzies and his time will never be repeated, we can nevertheless draw strength from Menzies and his ethos. Policies, changes, strategic outlooks evolve. The economy changes with time, but our humanity doesn't. We must hold on and advocate for truths rather than let them slip into disrepair. The late Martin Luther King had a beautiful turn of phrase. It was, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It's a beautiful turn of phrase. It really is. It invites us to believe that though change is slow, once human progress and liberty is achieved, then it cannot change. As a hope, I'd like to think it's true, but as a reality, I know it's not. It's true there has been remarkable progress in the way we see people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds, the way we see women in our society, the way we see LGBTI Australians. More Australians today are free to make a contribution to the future of their country than ever before. It's profoundly different than even 10, 20 or 50 years ago, and that's a good thing. But there are new threats to our freedoms, threats that have multiplied over the past decade. New technology has given us unlimited information at our fingertips, yet those same tools are now harnessed by criminals and bad faith actors, turning this advancement into a quagmire of human mistrust at a new Tower of Babel. It was Ronald Reagan who understood the success of free peoples is not inevitable. As he said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same, or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like when men were free. This is such a time for free peoples, to stand again for truths and to rebuild our shared democratic ethos. Peter Dutton said on Wednesday that this is a time for moral courage and moral clarity, and he's absolutely right. However, the story of humanity is also one where clarity emerges when much is at risk. It's why, in the midst of the Second World War, President Roosevelt spoke of the 4 freedoms. Robert Menzies took those 4 freedoms and claimed them for our party: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Freedom of speech because it's the proof of our God-given autonomy and our human dignity. freedom of worship because it asserts loyalties to belief, community and action. Freedom from want because poverty is its prison, and freedom from fear because autocrats, dictators and bullies will seek to coerce and control through intimidation. Today I want to speak about two of those freedoms, freedom of worship and freedom from fear, and I'll do so in the context of the disturbing rise of anti-Semitism in our country. I love our country, and I'm a proud Australian. Indeed, I'm a proud Jewish Australian. I love my country, I love my local community, and I love my faith community, which has contributed so much to the life and to the values which I try to bring to my contribution to Australian public life. This is the story of Jewish Australians. We are a beautiful but small community, about 100,000 Australians in a country of 26 million, about 0.4% of the population. Australia has always allowed Jewish people to be free, not just to worship, but to be. Australia is one of the few nations on earth that has never discriminated against Jewish people, and I honour that history today. And that generosity has been returned 100-fold with a community that Menzies once said was not only in Australia, but of Australia. Jewish Australians participate and give back. We volunteer and we serve. Go to any Commonwealth War cemetery and you'll inevitably find a Star of David among the Christian crosses. We give to this country and we've always been part of the mainstream. Nothing in this country has been off-limit to Jewish Australians. 2 Jewish Australians have been our head of state. Jewish Australians have headed the armed forces, served as Chief Justice, served as Federal Treasurer, as Health Minister and as Attorney General, and served as I do in the Federal Parliament. The remarkable thing, which is so Australian, is that all this has been so unremarkable, and indeed unremarked. It's the triumph of Australia that it never mattered. We judge people on the job that they do and not the book on which they might take an oath. For Jewish people, Australia's always been a safe and welcoming land with a good-hearted people. Today I want to speak to those good-hearted people about anti-Semitism and our national character. The vast middle of Australia have been horrified at what they saw at the Sydney Opera House and from the terrible events at Caulfield and Coogee. I believe it's one of Australia's crowning achievements that we live relatively free from sectarian, religious and ethnic conflict. One of the people who influenced that culture was Sir Robert Menzies. He abhorred and indeed fought against sectarianism at a time in our history when it was hard to do so. Indeed, in my view, it's the thing that most marks him out as a Liberal. Our longest-serving Prime Minister and the founder of the Liberal Party believed in, to use his words, and I quote, freedom for all, Catholic and Protestant, Jew and Gentile, and that to deny it was to go back to the dark ages of man. There was a moment when Sir Robert was in State Parliament when he was criticised, including by members of his own family, for attending the opening of a Catholic school. He said this to his critics, "You're overlooking one thing. I'm the member for East Yarra. Presbyterians, Anglicans, Roman Catholics, Brahmins, for all I know, certainly a few Jews are in the electorate. I think you've forgotten I'm the member for the lot, and consequently any of them who are of repute and respectable who want me to do something, I will do it if I can." It's the same approach I've taken as the member for Barara. I think I visit more Christian schools and churches than most Christians, and I value my Hindu and Baha'i friends, and after times like the Christchurch massacre, I'm proud to have reached out and visited the local Muslim community who are feeling incredibly vulnerable at their mosque, because I believe an attack on the freedom and safety of one is an attack on the freedom and safety of all, and all who share our freedom. And that's not to pat myself on the back. I did that because that's the Australian way. Menzies, invoking the metaphor of St. Paul, said of our country that we are members of one another, and that's true. We share the stories and memories of this land, the art, the music, the humour, the television and sport, from cricket to the Matildas. The foundation of our country is an ethos of responsibility, of generosity and acceptance, of hard work and laughter too. We aren't a people of airs and graces because we see the humanity of each other. I paid tribute to the Christian influence on our culture. At the time of Federation, Australia was overwhelmingly a Christian country. Almost everyone was a Christian adherent. Yet we chose to include in the Constitution a protection against the establishment of a national religion or religious tests for public office. Menzies, who we honour today at this conference, reflected a time when the values of faith strengthened and built this country from the family up. To quote the wonderful David Furse-Roberts, who's with you today, Menzies' faith drew from the well of decency and moral earnestness, independence and a sense of duty to improve society. That faith expressed itself not through proselytising to others, but through its wisdom, to do unto others that they would do unto you, to love your neighbour as yourself, and to engage with a great Judeo-Christian tradition, which is the universal question, who is my neighbour? This is the great Christian legacy we all benefit from, no matter what our faith or our lack of faith. So I want to speak about the emergence of anti-Semitism, which is an affront to our great national character. Anti-Semitism is not a new thing. It is a hatred which has endured throughout human history. It robs Jewish people of their God-given identity and their God-given individuality. It attributes to Jews a set of common negative characteristics, a selfish, greedy, controlling, privileged people that deserves to be attacked. The old hatred morphs with every generation. As you know, the last 6 weeks have been a trying time for Jewish people around the world with the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel. It was an event that drew out from our DNA the trauma and memory of thousands of years. And we saw things in our country that I had never thought we would see, with large anti-Semitic and violent protests here in Australia. What we've witnessed on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne has been shocking, but in some ways not surprising. The terror attacks of the 7th of October were the match that lit the kindling already in place. There's been a rise in anti-Semitism in Australia over a number of years. So much so, I introduced a private member's bill at the behest of Peter Dutton, which sought to ban Nazi symbols and salutes earlier in this year, and the government is currently finalising similar legislation. Anti-Semitism has been spread by the conspiracy theorists of the far right and the extremist Greens of the far left. The quiet rise of anti-Semitism prompted High Court Justice Jane Jago to address the topic in her Zelman Cowen lecture on the 5th of October this year. Note the date of that lecture, only 2 days before the terrorist attacks, reminding us that anti-Semitism is not a threat to Jewish people, it's a symptom of an underlying loss of confidence in liberal democratic ideals and practices. Quoting the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, Ahmed Shahid, Justice Jago reminds us that anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine of global hatred. As I said, the kindling was there. It's been quietly growing over the years. The petri dish of this cancer is the campuses of our universities. In August this year, the Australian Jewish University Experience Survey was released. It was undertaken by the Social Research Centre on behalf of the Zionist Federation of Australia and the Australasian Union of Jewish Students. The survey found some disturbing statistics. 64% of Jewish university students in this country had experienced anti-Semitism at university. 89% of these had experienced anti-Semitism in the last 12 months. 57% of Jewish students had hidden the fact that they were Jewish at university, and 19% had at some point stayed away from campus because of anti-Semitism. Just think about that, nearly 1 in 5 Jewish students staying away from campus because of anti-Semitism. When anti-Semitism occurred, 85% of students did not make a complaint, and those that did complain, 61% were dissatisfied with the outcome. Why is this? Because anti-Semitism is a byproduct of a flawed worldview being taught on our campuses. I call the anti-Semitism of the campus the anti-Semitism of the far left. It's different from the anti-Semitism of the far right. The anti-Semitism of the far right lives within the conspiracy theorists, the anti-vaxxers and the isolated. The anti-Semitism of the left grows on our campuses and is festered in classroom and discussion groups. It takes the lens of the modern left, seeing the world through the lens of the oppressed and the oppressors, that justice in the world is denied through inherited privilege, and that privilege must be struck down. Their argument goes as follows, and I've taken this directly from a left-wing piece that is online. If there are 1,000 people, 10 of them would be in our top 1%. 20 of them would be Jewish. 9 of them would be Jewish and in the top 1%. Then the clincher, and that brings together the entirety of modern left teaching. Ending white privilege, and I quote, starts with ending Jewish privilege. Little wonder then that we've seen the massive overlap between those who are part of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and in Australia and those now undertaking anti-Semitic protests. Let me be very clear. I support the right of any group to make peaceful protests. I particularly support the right of people to protest whom I disagree with, because that's what freedom is all about, the right of all of us to speak up. But mostly we haven't witnessed peaceful protests. On the steps of the Sydney Opera House, crowds chanted, "Kill the Jews, gas the Jews." We witnessed the appalling events at Caulfield targeting a synagogue as Jewish Australians were trying to observe Shabbat. We observed convoys targeting suburbs and streets with significant Jewish populations at night, and graffiti targeting Jewish businesses and homes. These anti-Semitic attacks conflate a person's Jewish faith and identity with a disagreement with the policies of the government of Israel. As Justice Jago reminded us in her 5th of October lecture, anti-Semitism involves the fallacy that Jews are an indivisible and non-individualised whole that can somehow be equated with and held collectively responsible for every action of Israel. In other words, the anti-Semitism directed at individual Australians is disguised by arguments about Israel and Gaza. As Georgina Downer put it so eloquently in her op-ed earlier this week, dressing anti-Semitism up as anti-Zionism doesn't vilify Jewish people any less. That is the challenge for the far left. In their almost semi-religious ideology with its focus on attributes, be they gender, race, religion, sexuality, all of which denies us our individuality, our autonomy, and our God-given gifts. It takes us back to ancient times where punishments were dispensed to sons and daughters for the sins of the parents. The world cannot only be seen through the lens of oppressors and oppression, or justice and injustice. It must be seen through the lens of freedom and choice, and individualism and autonomy, and through a lens that respects our differences. Let me say something, friends, about the way ahead. There are many ways we can tackle this moment. At the personal, community and national level, there are many things we can do, but today I want to focus on one area, and that is our universities. We have to engage in what is taught and the outcomes that follow, and we have to engage in the day-to-day policies that are making Australian universities anti-Semitic hotspots. Along with my friends, the Labor member for Macnamara, Josh Burns, and the independent member for Wentworth, Allegra Spender, I co-chair the Parliamentary Friends of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA. Our work has been to give practical effect to Holocaust remembrance through education and policy change. Long before the terror attacks of the 7th of October, the three co-chairs wrote to universities across Australia calling on them to adopt IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism. That definition spells out what anti-Semitism is. It includes things such as calling for, aiding or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion, making mendacious, dehumanising, demonising or stereotypical allegations about Jews, such as the power of Jews as collective, such as especially but not exclusively the myth of a world Jewish conspiracy or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government or other societal institutions. Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, and holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the State of Israel. Of Australia's nearly 40 public universities, only Monash, Melbourne, Macquarie, Wollongong, and the University of the Sunshine Coast has fully signed up. Mostly, we've been met with silence and excuses. Despite the evidence, university vice-chancellors are telling us there's nothing to see here. Well, indeed there is, and I'm pleased you're at a university today that has signed up to the definition. So I repeat my call to the campuses of Australian universities to adopt the IHRA international definition of anti-Semitism. Universities are multi-billion-dollar taxpayer-funded businesses, and Australian students deserve to attend universities which are free of political, racial and ethnic discrimination. The lack of moral clarity on so many of our campuses is just appalling. I think we've got to a point now where we need a formal independent inquiry into anti-Semitism on our campuses, with the terms of reference and a leader to undertake the inquiry to be worked out by government after consultation with the Jewish community. Separately, as Liberals, we need to find more ways of engaging again in the intellectual debates shaping our campuses and calling upon universities to remember and celebrate the Western tradition which has given us an inspiring story of progress and achievement. We see bright sparks with the Ramsay Centre's work at the University of Wollongong, the University of Queensland and Australian Catholic University, as well as the emergence of colleges such as Campion. However, we need to identify ways of accelerating a culture that celebrates democracy rather than one which seeks to tear down our liberal democratic traditions. Let me say something in conclusion about the Greens and anti-Semitism. We must tackle the hotbeds of anti-Semitism, and that includes calling out those who are whipping it up. It doesn't appear to me to be an accident that the epicentres of anti-Semitic rhetoric and action appear to be in areas where there is political jousting between Labor and the Greens, that is, the inner suburbs of our major cities. We've seen from the 7th of October that the Greens are treating the horrors of the war on Israel as an opportunity to whip up anti-Semitic hate. The Greens' behaviour online and in Parliament since the 7th of October on those matters has been nothing less than disgraceful. In doing so, they join a long line of opportunists who have targeted Jewish people since time began. As a Jewish Australian, I've always had an aversion to race-based politics. It's why I've always preferenced One Nation last. But frankly, it's clear to me now that the Greens are worse than One Nation. Yes, One Nation is full of kooks and conspiracy theory nut jobs, but anti-Semitism is now a full-blown feature of the extreme Greens political ideology. It represents a danger to Jewish Australians and to all Australians who value freedom. It's why I believe from here on in, the major parties of Australia must preference the Greens last. And I'm calling on the Liberal Party, the National Party and the Labor Party to put the Greens last in every seat at the next federal election. In conclusion, thank you all so much for giving me the privilege of speaking to you today. We live in a wonderful country. It's free, it's open, it's democratic. We are a beacon of freedom throughout the world. A truly successful multi-faith and multiracial, multicultural people. It's beholden on all of us to ensure that that bright light continues to shine away into the future. When we do so, we are well and truly honouring the memory of Sir Robert Menzies. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.